Can women be pastors? Well, according to Paul, women shouldn't teach or exercise authority over men. But was that just a cultural thing? And was it just Paul's own preference, not God's command? That's what we'll be covering in today's episode of the Following Jesus podcast. Hi, my name is David Cipriano. I'm a youth pastor, and my goal here is to help you follow Jesus. On this channel, we're all about teaching the Bible and biblical principles. We cover topics like theology, apologetics, Christian living, and in today's episode, we'll be covering a very controversial question, and that question is, should women be pastors? And we'll consider whether or not Paul's words in 1 Timothy chapter 2 are still binding today. But first, I want to talk about the two main views when it comes to gender roles, and these views are complementarian and egalitarian. On the complementarian side, these people believe that men and women are equally valuable, but they have distinct and complementary roles that are given to them by God. But then on the egalitarian side, they would say that men and women are equal and there are no gender-based distinctions. And so the way that you can remember these terms is that with complementarian, you believe that men's and women's roles complement each other, but with egalitarian, you think that men and women's roles are equal. So I want to make it clear that both views here believe that men and women are equal, but one view believes that men and women have different roles, while the other side does not. And the current trend that we see in churches today is the egalitarian view, but sadly, this is not the biblical view. I'm a complementarian, and I believe in that because that's what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that even though men and women are equal in value and in worth, they are different in role and responsibility. Now, when it comes to egalitarianism, I think that those who believe in it aren't completely ignoring the Bible, but they're twisting it. Sometimes when the Bible says one thing, they will twist it and explain it away, and sometimes they'll justify their positions by using verses out of context and wrongly applied. See, when it comes to the more inconvenient passages for egalitarians, they'll sometimes just say, that's cultural, that's wrongly translated, that's wrongly interpreted. Sometimes they'll use verses out of context, or they might use one Bible story to disprove another Bible story. And these people, they're not totally ignoring the Bible, but they're using it wrongly. And so I don't think that you can make the egalitarian view fit with the Bible because of all of the Bible's very clear commands. And for me, I will always agree and affirm that men and women are equal. Men are not more valuable than women. Women are not more valuable than men. But I also recognize from the Bible's position that men and women are different. Not just that men and women are different in personality or in emotions or in biology, but in their God-given gender roles. God has given men and women each different responsibilities. And when it comes to the question of whether or not women can be pastors, I think that there is one passage that is very clear about this, and it's 1 Timothy 2, where it says, "Let the women learn in silence with all subjection, but I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." And so I see this very clear command here that women should not be pastors. They shouldn't be teaching men in an authoritative or a pastoral way. And sure, this view is not popular. It is a very controversial belief, and I'm okay with you disagreeing with me about this one. And for those of you who disagree, there's many different counter arguments to this passage and this position. There's a lot of pushbacks to the complementarian position here. There's some different attempts to explain it away. And so I'm going to cover a lot of those arguments in my defenses to those arguments. And I think that this will be helpful to people who are egalitarians and they disagree with my position to help fight against that belief. And I also think that this will be helpful for complementarians such as myself. And maybe you're wondering about a lot of these questions, and maybe you come to debate somebody on these issues. Hopefully this video will help prepare you for those moments. So one of the counter arguments to this passage is that they'll say, say that this was only Paul's preference and not a biblical command. So if you look at what Paul says here, he says, I suffer not. Or maybe your translation says, I do not permit, or I do not allow. And so the idea here is that Paul is just simply giving his preferences. Paul didn't want for women to be pastors. And so even though Paul didn't want for women to be pastors, his preferences are not binding on us today. But really, if we just look at the book of 1 Timothy, this was how Paul often worded things. For example, in 1 Timothy 2:1, he says, I exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men. He said later in verse 8, I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. And so if we're going to say that whenever Paul says, I suffer not, or I do not permit, and we take that to say that this was just simply his preference and not a command, then what do you do with these other verses? Whenever Paul says that he exhorts people to pray, or that he wills for people to pray everywhere, is that just a preference too? Is this just simply one man's opinion, or is it a command? Is it a divinely inspired command given from an apostle? Well, these were really commands and not just preferences. And if we're going to say that since Paul worded it this certain way as I suffer not or I do not permit, then that means it's just simply a preference, then that would invalidate a lot of things that Paul said. So clearly this was not just his preference. And we have to keep in mind here that with this passage, this was the Apostle Paul. This was not just some random guy giving his opinion or his interpretation. No, this was a man who was speaking under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and he had apostolic authority. Now, another counter-argument that people will give to this passage is that Paul was just saying this because women were uneducated in that time. And so the people who will use this argument will say that women in the first century were typically uneducated. They lacked some formal education. But since that's not true in our culture today, then women can be pastors. And so they'll take this command about women not teaching to say that it's only because they were uneducated. But I think that there's a few problems with this. For one, the context of the passage never hints at this idea. This is not a belief that you would get just from reading the scripture. In 1 Timothy 2, nowhere talks about educational status being a qualifier. In fact, Paul actually affirms women learning, because remember what he said in chapter 2, verse 11, let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. So if Paul is promoting the education of women in theology and in church, then how could he also be disqualifying them because of a lack of education in the very next verse? See, if it was just about the lack of education for women, then why didn't Paul just say, I suffer not an uneducated woman to teach? And really, why would women be singled out here? Because if the problem was just a lack of education, then that should apply to men too. And if a formal education was required in order to be a teacher or a pastor, then Jesus' own disciples were unqualified. Jesus did not just pick the best and the brightest. No, he picked untrained, unqualified men to share his word. You see in Acts chapter 4, verse 13, it says, Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. And so the very disciples of Jesus were unlearned and ignorant men. So clearly having a lack of formal education was not a disqualifier. So why would Paul be saying here that women were unqualified just simply because women in that culture typically didn't have a good education? That just doesn't make sense. That's not being honest with the text. Now, another counter-argument that people will have here when it comes to women being pastors is the defense that women in the Bible often had leadership positions. And basically, this fact is used to ignore and to dismiss chapters like 1 Timothy 2. People are using one verse to dismiss another verse. And these people will point to examples like Deborah, Miriam, Huldah, Esther, Priscilla, Phoebe, Anna. And these people will act like these stories disprove very clear commands from other places in the Bible. And one of the problems here is that you can't just use one Bible passage to dismiss or disprove another. No, the Bible works together with itself, not against itself. And I think that as a complementarian, I want for everybody to know that we don't think that women shouldn't have any leadership positions at all. At least that's not what you should believe. That's not the complementarian position here. Now, maybe some extremists or maybe some sexists or some patriarchalists will say this, and they think that women should never have any leadership positions, but that's not biblical and that's not right. And to say that complementarians believe that is inaccurate and even dishonest. You see, Bible believers and complementarians should and do affirm that women can have some leadership positions. But while the Bible does describe women in leadership positions, they're never seen as pastors, and they're never seen as authoritative spiritual leaders over men. And so when people use this argument that women in the Bible were leaders, that's true. But it doesn't disprove passages like 1 Timothy 2 or 1 Corinthians 14. Now, another argument that egalitarians will give when trying to disprove 1 Timothy 2 is to say that women just shouldn't be false teachers. Now, in my opinion, this is a really bad argument. I think that some of these other arguments that we're covering are better arguments, but this one just doesn't really make a lot of sense. It seems pretty invalid. And even though this argument is sort of low-hanging fruit, I'm going to cover this one for a little bit anyways. So when people say that this passage just means that women shouldn't be false teachers, you have to think about it, because if that's what Paul was really trying to say, then his actual words were a very dumb way to say it. If Paul is just saying that women shouldn't be false teachers, why on earth did he word it the way that he did? Now, sure, women shouldn't be false teachers, but neither should men. And if the command was really just about being false teachers, then why would he single out women and say that women shouldn't teach, but not men? And really, I think that this whole argument is just entirely made up. This isn't backed by context. It's not proven by other Bible passages or anything else. It's just forcibly inserted into the text. It's trying to make the Bible say what you want it to mean. Now, as a side note, when it comes to false teachings like egalitarianism, I think that a good sign that a position is wrong is by looking at how bad the arguments are that are in favor of it. And I think that that comes into play here, because whenever we say that 1 Timothy 2 doesn't actually condemn women being pastors, that's a bad position, and we can know that it's a bad position by how bad so many of the arguments are that are supporting this false teaching. Now, on the topic of bad arguments, I'm going to give probably the worst one and the most dangerous one, and it's that this passage just shouldn't be in the Bible. And the people who argue this will say that this passage, or really just these few verses, were added by a scribe. So in other words, this passage was not originally there, but it was added later. Now, if there was a shred of evidence to back this up, I would be willing to listen to this argument. I would be willing to at least consider it if there were some earlier manuscripts with this passage missing, but then all of a sudden, hundreds of years later, it appears. But that's not true at all. This argument is completely fabricated, and I think that this might just be the cheapest way of writing this verse off, just by saying, oh, it shouldn't be in the Bible. And I think that this sets a really dangerous precedent here, because the people who do this are essentially saying, if I don't agree with the Bible, I'm just going to pretend like this verse shouldn't be there. Even if there's no evidence to back it up, I get to decide what is God's word and what is not God's word. That's a really dangerous place to be. And really, these people are removing from God's words. See, here's what the Bible says in Deuteronomy 4:2. Ye shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall ye diminish aught from it, that ye may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you. And so it's a very serious sin whenever we add to or remove from the words of God. It's a problem whenever we try to add verses to the Bible. It's a problem when we try to take away from the words of the Bible. No, we shouldn't be adding or subtracting to God's word. It's saying, I know better than God. It's saying God's word is insufficient. My will is best. And this is a really bad place to be. And so that argument is what I believe is the worst argument for the egalitarian position about this passage. But here's what I think the best one is, or at least the most popular argument. And it's that 1 Timothy 2 was only a cultural command and not relevant for today. And so this is probably the most common pushback. And first, I want to give some legitimacy to this type of argument, because I think that it can be really easy for many conservative Christians to just say the Bible never made cultural commands, or that all commands are for all times. But really, I think that if we're being honest, and if we look at all of the Bible in context, some commands in the Bible are cultural. For example, whenever we see the command to give each other a holy kiss, that's not really applied to all cultures today. Or when we read in 1 Corinthians about head coverings, I also don't think that those are for today in our culture. And so I would say that a few things in the Bible are about culture, but those commands are very rare. And I think that whenever a command is cultural, it's very obviously so. And I think that this is a really common defense tactic that people will sometimes use. Whenever you find a Bible passage that you disagree with or you dislike, it's very common to say, oh, that's just cultural. That's not for us today. That was commanded because of this cultural thing. And really, that's not a very honest way to interpret the Bible. And this argument sometimes makes it very easy to just write off anything that you disagree with. And I'm not saying that nothing in the Bible could have ever been a cultural command, but I'm saying that we shouldn't just automatically say this anytime that we disagree with something. We have to have really good evidence that that really was the case. And I think that if Paul's command to not let women teach men, or to not let women be pastor, was just simply a cultural command, then that would have been a sexist culture. And if we're dealing with a sexist culture, then we should realize that the church isn't obligated to follow sexism. The church isn't obligated to follow the culture. And I think that whenever we look at all of these pushbacks, they're really just attempts to ignore and explain away the Bible's very clear command and God's intended design for gender roles. And there's actually a very clear reason why Paul's command is not just cultural. And it tells us why this is a command in the next verse. You see, if you had just kept on reading, you would know why Paul says what he says. So we see Paul's controversial words in verses 11 and 12, where he says, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection, but I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." And often our attention is all on just those two verses. We read those and then we stop reading, and we hyperfixate on those two verses as if those are the only verses in the chapter. But Paul continues on, and he explains why he said what he said. And he's proving that this is not just a cultural command, not just about the lack of women's education, not just his personal preference. No, nothing like that. Here's what he says. "For Adam was first formed, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression." And so people will give so many pushbacks and counter-arguments to the Bible's command, and there's so many different explanations for why Paul said what he said, but if you had just kept reading the passage, then you would see the reason for this command. Paul actually gives a reason for not allowing women to pastor or to preach to men. And here's why. There's two reasons. Because God made Adam first, and because Eve was deceived. You see, God created man first. He created Adam before he created Eve. And God had this structure of male headship in mind at creation. And Eve was deceived. Now, I want to clarify that whenever Paul says that Eve was deceived, he's not saying that women are more easily deceived, but that Eve was. So this was not about all women, just one specific woman. Sometimes people will read this and they'll say that the reason why women shouldn't be pastors is because women are more easily deceived and they wouldn't be as good at pastoring. But that's not what the Bible is saying, and I'm not even sure that it's true that women are more easily deceived, because very many men are easily deceived as well. And so this argument is not exactly true, and it's not even a great reason if it is true. So Paul was saying that one of the reasons why women shouldn't be pastors is simply because Eve was deceived. This was a result and a consequence of the fall. And this is not God punishing all of women because of Eve's sin. This is just simply a consequence of the fall. So I think that it's obvious that this biblical design in church leadership is bigger than just culture. And there's a definite reason given in the Bible right after the command comes. It shouldn't just be left up to personal interpretation or personal preference. No, the Bible is very clear. Women are not to pastor. Not because they wouldn't be good at it, but because it's God's design. And I also want for you to notice that throughout all of the Bible, the biblical qualifications for pastors are all about men. Whenever we see the requirements for being a pastor, also known in the Bible as a bishop or an elder, it's assumed that this person is going to be a man. For example, whenever we see the requirements given in 1 Timothy 3, it says, "This is a true saying, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride he fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil." And so we see that from these requirements, this is clearly not gender neutral. No, it's only referring to men. Whenever we look at all of the pronouns, it's all he, him, his. Women are not included in this. And if women can be pastors, then how do you explain this? If God wanted for both men and women to be pastors, then why wouldn't the biblical requirements for pastors be gender neutral? We see this again in Titus chapter 1, where it says, "For this cause left I thee in Crete, that thou shouldest set in order the things that are wanting, and ordain elders in every city, as I had appointed thee, if any be blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of riot or unruly. For a bishop must be blameless, as the steward of God, not self-willed, not soon angry, not given to wine, no striker, not given to filthy lucre, but a lover of hospitality, a lover of good men, sober, just, holy, temperate, holding fast the faithful word as he hath been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers." And so again, we see that the pastoral requirements are only given to men. It's not gender neutral. Women are not included in this. But I also want to point out that not only are women biblically disqualified from being pastors, but a majority of men are as well. Because if you were to look at an honest look at all of men, most of them would not fit these requirements. And so even though people like to look at this issue as being men versus women and seeing that women can't be pastors, but men can, realize that most men cannot be either. Most men are biblically unqualified. I also want to point out that there are no examples of women pastors in the Bible. You see, out of all the pastors that we see throughout the New Testament, none of them are women. Not Priscilla, not Euodias or Syntyche, not Phoebe. No, the Bible gives no examples of women pastors in the Bible. Now, some may argue that it was the first century and culture back then would not have allowed for a woman to be pastor, but really God's design is not dependent on culture. God doesn't wait for culture to catch up, and then God's allowed to do what he wants to do. No, God does what he wills, regardless of culture. And culture doesn't and shouldn't be driving the church. The Bible commands that women shouldn't be pastors, and they shouldn't be teaching men in a pastoral way. And we see that the biblical qualifications are all clearly only addressed to men, and we see that there's no women pastors in the Bible. And whenever we take all of those facts and combine them, it's very clear that women should not be pastors. Not because we're being sexist, not because we think that women wouldn't be good at pastoring, but this is simply God's design. To have a woman be a pastor goes against biblical commands. Now, I also want to give some clarifications with all of these things because for many of you who are listening to this and you disagree, you might interpret my beliefs to be way more extreme than they actually are. And so I just want to clarify some things and add some context and some understanding. For one, women are not to be totally silent in the church. This is sometimes a view that people will get mistakenly because they'll read some Bible verses and be confused by them and maybe interpret them the wrong way. For example, in the passage that we've been covering for much of this episode, 1 Timothy 2:11-12, it says, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection, but I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." And this is kind of similar to what 1 Corinthians 14:34 says, "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law." And sometimes people will take these passages to the extreme. Some people will have the idea that women shouldn't be praying out loud in church, or that women shouldn't be making announcements, or things like that. Some churches would even say that women shouldn't be saying amen during the sermon, or that they shouldn't sing. But I think that this is wrong, it is out of context, and it is badly interpreting these passages, because women are not to be totally silent. And when we see this command in 1 Timothy 2, we see that learning in silence is being opposed to teaching. And if you were to look at a church service, really the only person speaking at once is the pastor or the one who is preaching. And so everybody else in the auditorium, both men and women, are all learning in silence as opposed to teaching. And so Paul isn't saying in 1 Timothy 2 that women shouldn't ever speak or that they shouldn't ever make any kind of noise. No, they're learning in silence as opposed to teaching. And so a woman is to be quiet in the sense that she doesn't teach men in the church, and she shows her submission to authority by learning. And this is not supposed to be an absolute command for women to remain silent at all times in all services. And some evidence for this is found in 1 Corinthians 11:5, where Paul affirms women praying and prophesying in church. And really, the Bible doesn't say that women should never teach. And we'll get to an example of this later on in the episode. But even though the Bible doesn't say that women should never teach, it does say that women shouldn't be preaching or taking authority over men in the pastoral position. Now, getting back again to 1 Corinthians 14:34, this is where Paul says, "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law." So if we were to look at the whole context of 1 Corinthians 14, we would see that church services were chaotic and they were out of order. And if you look at the verses leading up to 34, Paul was telling all kinds of groups to be quiet at certain times. Whenever he's talking about the issue of speaking in tongues, he says in verse 28, "But if there be no interpreter, let him keep silence in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God." Whenever it comes to prophecy, he says in verses 29 and following, "Let the prophets speak 2 or 3, and let the other judge. If anything be revealed to another that sitteth by, let the first hold his peace." Or we'd probably say, "Be silent. For ye may all prophesy one by one, that all may learn, and all may be comforted. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets." And so not only did Paul say that those speaking in tongues should be silent sometimes, he's also saying that the prophets should be silent at times as well. And the reason is found in verse 33, where it says, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints." And so in a church where services were chaotic and out of control, and they were just a mess, Paul is telling all of these types of groups to be silent at some points. It doesn't make any sense to have everybody speaking all at once. And that's how we get to 34 when Paul says, "Let your women keep silence in the churches." You see, the context here is about interpreting tongues and prophecies, and this is not meant to be an absolute, unconditional command. No, it's rather for a certain setting. Women are not supposed to be totally silent in church, and that's not what the Bible says. And even though we might find some verses that might seem to say that, if you really look at the context here, that's not what it says, and that's not what it means. I also want to say that women can serve in ministry. You see, egalitarians and those in favor of women being pastors will often give the comeback that the Bible affirms women being in ministry, and as a complementarian, I agree. The Bible does affirm that. At the church that I attend, I appreciate all the women who participate in ministry, such as singing in worship, playing in the orchestra, the women who teach Sunday school classes and children's classes. I appreciate the women who help in the nursery and in the sound room. I'm thankful for the women who help in the kitchen and who help to clean the church. And honestly, our church wouldn't be able to make it without all of the women who are in ministry. And the Bible affirms women being in ministry. The Apostle Paul refers to women as his fellow laborers. We see Phoebe being described as a servant of the church. We see Priscilla, who served with the Apostle Paul, and with her husband, she taught the way of God. I see Dorcas, who served the poor. But even though the Bible affirms women being in ministry, women should not be pastors, because the biblical qualifications for pastors are very clearly written about men, not women. The Bible has no examples of women being pastors. And the Bible makes it clear that even though women can and should be serving, they shouldn't have that specific role. And even the Bible isn't saying that women should never lead or never teach, but rather that they shouldn't in this one capacity. A woman should not be the pastor over a man. And really, pastoring and preaching to men is the only thing in church ministry that women are biblically forbidden to do. I believe that they can do every other ministry role, and that includes teaching. For example, in Acts chapter 18, the Bible tells us, "And a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. And And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them, and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. So this husband and wife couple had to correct some type of false doctrine that Apollos was teaching. The Bible says that they expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. And so I believe here that the Bible is affirming a woman teaching a man, and a woman being used to correct a man's theology. So I think that the Bible isn't telling us that women should never teach, and it's not even telling us that she should never teach a man. So even though women shouldn't be pastoring, and they shouldn't be preaching to men in the pastoral setting, there are settings where a woman can teach a man. For example, women can teach Bible classes, they can do podcasts, they might make social media content, they can write books, and personally, I've been helped by all of these things. I've had women teachers in my life, and I've learned a lot from them, but none of those women were ever my pastor. And so the Bible isn't saying that women shouldn't be in ministry, and it's not even saying that they shouldn't ever teach or teach a man, but they shouldn't be pastors. And so I really hope that you see throughout this episode my true reasons for my belief that women shouldn't pastor. It's not because I think that they wouldn't be good at it. It's not because I'm being sexist or old-fashioned or misogynistic. It's just simply because I believe the Bible. And this was God's clear design, and I don't think that we should twist it. I don't think that we should pretend like it was just a cultural command, or like those verses were added wrongly by a scribe. We shouldn't just say that this was Paul's personal opinion. No, nothing like that. We should just simply believe the Bible and accept it. So that's going to be it for today's episode. I really hope that this was helpful and educational for all of you who listened to it. If you guys have any questions or even disagreements with my thoughts, then leave a comment down below. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more biblical teaching like this.